York Times is out with a new piece on Ukraine's, quote, thorny history with Nazi imagery in its military. Quote, troops' use of patches bearing Nazi emblems risks fueling Russian propaganda and spreading imagery that the West has spent a half-century trying to eliminate.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald commented on the piece, tweeting, amazing article from New York Times about the rather uncomfortable fact that photos of Ukrainian soldiers and leading battalions so often include Nazi symbols and flags. For a decade, the Western press warned Ukraine's fighters were dominated by Nazi units. Yeah, this article exploded on the internet yesterday because, frankly, as we well know, for months, viral image after viral image has been circulating of Ukrainian soldiers with various kinds of Nazi symbols on them. There was the incident where Jon Stewart was awarding a medal to someone who ended up having a Nazi tattoos. It's the incidence of this happening in high-profile photos on the front cover of these major newspapers, et cetera, is so bizarre that it leads one to the conclusion that you can't escape, that this is not some incidental, accidental, small, marginal number of people in this military force who are openly touting Nazi ideology. But this article feels like the New York Times is finally forced to confront that reality after having published so many images of Nazis themselves. And instead of taking it head on, the article itself reads as apologia for what it's trying to describe.
Yeah.
So people have been ripping this apart. They say, well, the Nazi symbol, the swastika symbol, was once a Hindu symbol, so maybe these are just Ukrainian Hindus. I guess is supposed to be the implication. They raised the Confederate flag, saying, well, just like some people in the South say the Confederate flag is just about their pride in history. Maybe some people think that the swastika.
U.S. liberals usually call BS on that argument.
Exactly.
In every other context, they say, no. We don't care, why your whatever twisted logic or rationale you've come up with to defend this imagery. We know what it actually stands for. One would think that's the same thing with Nazi imagery.
Nope.
But because, again, liberal, Democrat, mainstream type people are so bought into the Ukrainian war effort against Russia, you have to look the other way or pretend it means something else and all that, or apply all sorts of greater contextualizing that never happens in cases of hate crimes and, graffiti of like hate symbols in the U.S. context. No, that's the worst thing you can do. There's no further exploration of what it means or, well, think of the context. The media never does that.
Yeah, and the reason is because Putin has been saying that part of the project is to denazify Ukraine. And to acknowledge that there are a non-trivial number of Nazis in Ukraine is to them validating Putin's narrative. Now, I would argue that everywhere needs to be denazified. That doesn't necessarily mean it justifies an invasion.
Not by an invasion at gunpoint.
But I'm not going to put myself in a position as arguing in favor of Nazification. So another thing the article does is use the fact of Zelensky being Jewish as a counter argument. How could his bodyguards be Jewish? How could the people surrounding him wearing swastikas and other kinds of Nazi paraphernalia be Nazis if they're protecting someone who's Jewish? You don't need a PhD to realize that those things can exist in the same time. They try to explain there's symbols called Totenkampfs, which were apparently used by Nazi concentration camp guards. And they say, well, it's also a symbol that's used by a musical band. So that's neither here nor there, admitting that it is a Nazi musical band. They say, it was impossible to make an inference about the wearer or the Ukrainian army based on this patch. That was from the Anti-Defamation League, League's Jay
really
Hyman.
Softballing. The Anti-Defamation League, I have never seen. They've never met a hate symbol they would not eagerly denounce before. I'm just saying.
Except now, it's like this plain running. Cover.
This is a group that I remember their surveys and their studies about how because of Trump. Anti-Semitic hate is rampant in American schools, and they had this very the methodology of it not at all persuasive to me when I looked into it a little bit, to suggest that anti-Semitic hate bullying incidents were rampantly increasing throughout American schools and were explicitly due to Donald Trump's rhetoric.
And now they're saying that there's an indifference to
now this like, well, it could be offensive to some people. Jewish people.
Well, the Anti-Defamation, that's what's so toxic about this. The Anti-Defamation League, which ostensibly should be the ones calling out legitimate instances of anti-Semitism and Nazi ideology like this, are in fact running cover for it because of this broader political project. So in this other paragraph, the Times writes, in November, during a meeting with Times reporters near the front line, a Ukrainian press officer wore a Totenkopf variation made by a company called R3ICH, pronounced Reich. He said he did not believe the patch was affiliated with the Nazis. The patch made by the organization called Reich.
Oh, I'm sure there's a
Reich
easy
with a 3.
explanation for it. Who among us hasn't?
And the article just credulously takes these statements and just runs with it. There's offers no pushback whatsoever. Moreover, people have pointed out that there's a way that they try to recharacterize the Soviet Union's role in defeating the Nazis, suffering more casualties of war than anybody else, as somehow an ambivalent position or something that they shouldn't get all the credit in the world for, and do what some people are describing as propagating their own kind of Nazi propaganda by saying that when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, many Ukrainians saw them as liberators. I mean, it's like really, really galaxy brain stuff.
Right. This should be a reminder that, look, in other parts of the world, in Europe, they have been fighting people, Russians, Germans, Ukrainians, all the peoples of Eastern Europe have been, Europe all over the entire continent, warfare for hundreds and hundreds of years. There are ethnic conflicts.
Sure.
There used to be religious-based conflicts. There are conflicts going back centuries family conflict, things that people still feel something for that we don't necessarily understand because we're somewhere else and they're somewhere else. And we can't, force how we feel about things on everyone else. There are conflicts that we can't, that just can't be solved necessarily easily by the U.S. just saying, you got to stop hating each other, you got to stop fighting. And it's complicated because there are people who are unsavory. I mean, we encounter this in the Middle East. People who are unsavory to us for a lot of reasons, but are they the good guys in this conflict because we hate these people more? And then where does that get us when we arm them and then somebody else ends up with the weapons? And it doesn't turn out well because we should try generally to mind our own business in a foreign policy context is actually what the American people support.
Sure, but what's happening here is that the New York Times is doing PR, not neutrally saying, hey, maybe we should help Ukraine, but there's some bad folks in the mix, but we should help them on a broader general principle. It's running cover for them. I mean, people who are more knowledgeable are pointing out that there are all of these non-ambiguous acts, the reburying of these Galazin soldiers, these soldiers from what was apparently a notorious Nazi unit. A ceremony was done by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to rebury them just a couple of years ago. These symbols abound. And these folks are being characterized in the book, in the article as historical groups, some of which may have been Nazis, but that wasn't their main bag. And over again in the article, there is this very explicit effort to acknowledge, but downplay what so many people in social media and in independent news have been reporting on as a real problem for years. And frankly, I think the effect is that it makes Ukraine look worse than if the paper had just acknowledged the reality of what's going on in the country at the top. Because now it looks like a cover job, and the implication is it's so much worse than just the people who are showing up with the odd badge or tattoo or what have you. And again, it's worth noting just the sheer number of incidents that are cataloged in the context of this article, much less beyond.
Right. It clearly goes beyond there were just 3 people in 3 photos that got photographed with Nazi regalia. It seems like it's a more significant aspect of the Ukrainian army than readers of the New York Times have previously been led to believe.
Yeah.
So I am glad to see a little bit of acknowledgement, even if it's kind of, I agree with your criticisms of how they framed it. But I think even this article is going to be something of a revelation for a lot of people who only get their information from the New York Times. And be like, what? There's Nazis in the Ukrainian army?
Yeah,
what is
well, that's
that?
a Putin talking point up until this time. And
right.
a friend of mine noted that a lot of the Ukraine articles don't have comments on them in the New York Times because it was part of like an ongoing news update section that didn't allow comments. This article does allow comments, and when we talked about it yesterday, he pointed out that there were hundreds.
Yeah.
It was a very active comment section of people expressing frustrations with how this was handled.
I always tell you not to read the comments, Briahna.
Well, we'll definitely be reading the comments on this article. We'll have more rising for you right after this.